Welcome and thank you so much for coming to this policy exchange event, Welfare, When Does the State Say No? I'm Isabel Hardman and I work for The Spectator and I'm going to be chairing today's event. We're going to have a very lively session, I think, today with a great panel considering what the welfare state should look like today. How big should it be? Who should it really support? Working age welfare costs the UK government close to £120 billion a year. So our speakers today will be considering how that should be spent or how it should be cut. Our illustrious panel is Conservative MP John Redwood, former Chief Policy Advisor to Margaret Thatcher, who has served as a minister in a number of roles, including Secretary of State for Wales, and has also worked as Shadow Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Environment, Transport and the Regions and Deregulation. Kate Bell is the London Campaign Coordinator at the Child Poverty Action Group, and she has also worked as the Director of Policy, Advice and Communications at the single-parent charity Gingerbread. Matthew Oakley is Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange. He focuses on welfare reform, growth in the UK economy, public sector reform and financial policy. So a very small brief, clearly. He was previously an economic advisor at the Treasury. And Mehdi Hassan is the Political Director of Huffington Post UK and presenter of Al Jazeera English's The Cafe. So we're going to start off with John Redwood.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think our welfare benefits are generous enough for those who most need them. But I also think our welfare bill is too large for the country to afford. So that leads me in the direction of trying to answer the question posed, to say that we need to look more at eligibility than at the level of benefit. When we are looking at the level of the benefit, I think in the case of severely disabled people, I always feel we're not nearly generous enough and we need to recognise rather more the extra stresses and strains in their life, and I think we should be more generous. We also need to look at the general economic context, because it is much easier to have falling welfare bills if the opportunities for work and self-reliance are that much stronger. We do seem at the moment to be in a long transition away from substantial emphasis on universal benefits to rather more emphasis on targeted or means-tested benefits. The whole idea of universal credit is to try and give people more support who are on the lower incomes. And there is a growing popularity in quite a few of the political parties for the idea that people on high incomes or with high savings and accumulated wealth should not be in receipt of the traditional universal benefits they have been receiving. The coalition has taken this approach in the case of some of the benefits for children, and there is an active debate in the run-up to the next general election on whether the same kind of consideration should now apply to benefits for the elderly. I think in case of the three traditional major parties that win seats in the House of Commons, it's a question of who is going to be the first mover, because obviously they all fear that it will be unpopular with elderly people, and elderly people tend to vote more reliably than younger people. So there could be some damage in being the first mover, but the atmosphere seems to be moving in the direction of perhaps all the main parties shifting towards the proposition where maybe richer elderly people don't deserve all of the universal benefits, targeted benefits they've currently been getting. So we are back to the very long-standing argument of why would you favour more means-tested benefits, and what could their disadvantages be, and is there a residual case for more or for the maintenance of the existing universal benefits. I think I do come down in favour of more targeted benefit provision to resolve my problem, that I want it to be more generous in certain cases, therefore I have to pay fewer people benefits. And it's easiest to remove a universal benefit from a rich person than to play around with the benefit entitlements of more marginal cases where some would be more sympathetic than others. And the main argument against means-tested targeted benefits is that, of course, it creates a why work trap if you don't do it very well. And it's one of those mathematical facts of life that if you have means-tested benefits, then people on relatively low incomes are very likely to end up paying higher marginal rates of tax and benefit withdrawal than people on higher incomes are paying in terms of tax. And when people complain about this, you have to explain to them that if you wish to get people off means-tested benefits, you have to withdraw the means-tested benefit in some way at some level. And there is no great answer to this. You can either have a few people facing very high marginal rates of tax and benefit withdrawal, the short, sharp shock approach to benefit withdrawal, or you can have a large number of people facing moderately high marginal rates of benefit withdrawal and taxation if you have very pronounced elongated tapers. But there is no easy or correct answer. We live in an imperfect world, and so I've taken my logic so far that for preference I have to like more means-tested rather than universal, and I then have to live with the fact that I have to make a difficult decision about the rate of withdrawal to try and make sure that there still is an incentive left in the system, but again to make sure that there isn't so much incentive left in the system that the benefit bill remains out of control because the tapers are so elongated and so many people are still receiving benefit where the case for them to do so is not so clear. Best benefit reform of all is clearly a buoyant economy. It is good news that despite very little overall growth in recent years since the crash, the economy now does have a pretty good capacity for generating private sector jobs, and that has more than offset the job losses in the public sector, some of which are anyway changes in definition rather than actual job losses. But what we need to do is to get better at making sure we can generate enough jobs for the expanding workforce, and that also means I think we need to look at the role of migration control in benefit reform, because we need to make sure that more of the new jobs being generated are available and likely to be taken by people who are already here on benefit, rather than inviting in lots of new people to take the extra jobs and still leaving ourselves with millions of people at home on benefit who aren't as competitive or aren't in the right place at the right time to get the job that the economy is beginning to generate. We need to recognise, when looking at the 220 billion plus of transfer payments, social security and pensions in our economy, that by far and away the dominant amount of money goes to pensioners. And I think we need to, in passing, mention the continuing need for pension reform. I think the coalition is going in the right direction. I don't think that about everything, you will be amazed to learn. But I think it is going in the right direction on this because it is recognising that the standard state pension is inadequate, and you obviously need all sorts of top-ups to it, either ones you save for or ones the state provides to be able to live at a sensible level. So they're trying to get to a higher basic state retirement pension, but the quid pro quo for that, I think, has to mean that you get it at a later age. Because we have lived through a phenomenal 20 years when the average expectation of life has risen so that you are likely to live for a lot longer. All those earlier years when you were paying in national insurance, you thought you were not going to get so many years in pension as you now look as if you're going to get. And we have to persuade people that that is true. We're not taking away something they paid in for. We're trying to adapt something which has become much more expensive than the original deal imagined. So I think there the trade-off is very clear. We do need to take these reviews seriously and up the retirement age so that we can have a more generous retirement pension that people have directly contributed for. And we need some justice between those who sacrificed in their working lives to save for their own retirement and those who didn't. And that is a very interesting moral dilemma. You don't want to leave those who made no provision with totally inadequate lifestyles, but surely there has to be some incentive or advantage for all those who did sacrifice, who saved a lot, and now find that their deal has been changed by successive governments because it's now taxed very differently from the way they were told it was going to be taxed when they first started making that pension provision. I'm very conscious I've got very few minutes, so I think I'll pause there, but there are plenty of ideas to develop in discussion.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Policy Exchange for the invitation. It's really great to be able to talk about these issues with such an interesting panel. I thought what I'd do in this is just try and take the question posed by the title of the event at face value, and really think about the conditions when we might think that the state should say no, and whether those conditions are currently being met. So first, I think if social security becomes unaffordable for the economy, we're all going to disagree about exactly what point that is, but we probably all agree that there is a point when social security would be simply unaffordable, and we'd have to reduce expenditure. Secondly, I think we probably all agree that social security inevitably has some impact on work incentives, as John was talking about, but there may be a point again at which social security is having such a significant impact on work incentives that we need to think again about the balance. And lastly, one of the primary functions of social security, of course, is to prevent poverty. So if we think that we've solved that problem, then obviously we might think again about our social security expenditure. So I just wanted to kind of look at where we are on each of those questions. This is a chart that shows social security expenditure as a proportion of GDP, and it uses both the national accounts figures and the DWP's own estimates. And what it's really showing is that social security expenditure as a proportion of GDP had really flatlined before the recession, and the significant increases we've seen really are as a result, as John again was saying, of the kind of economic situation we've been in. And I think it's quite hard to look at this graph and say, if you see the kind of falls in the level of expenditure from the mid-1990s, and suggest that social security expenditure is so out of control that we really necessarily need to be looking at cutting back. Another way of looking at this is to look at the UK's expenditure in comparative levels. So this is OECD data that shows social security expenditure in a range of European countries. And it's showing it in 1980 and in 2009, that's the green bars. And you can see that the UK, again, is really kind of at the bottom of the table in international terms. So just fourth from the bottom there, with just very liberal countries like the US, Australia, and in fact with Greece coming ahead of us. What about thinking about the impact of social security on work incentives at the moment? So this chart is showing the number of people of out-of-work benefits. That's the blue line, and then it changes because the data set changes to the red line. And again, you can see that was gradually coming down before we got to the impact of the recession, and we saw this slight increase. Real rises in expenditure, of course, have been on tax credits, and that's partly because the generosity of tax credits increased, but it's also because with the wage squeeze that everyone's kind of now recognising, we've seen the need for expenditure on tax credits for topping up in-work incomes increasing, and I think if we were thinking about places to reduce expenditure, that might be one of them. This is a chart just showing you the level of job seekers' allowance as kind of a proportion of average earnings. Again, just thinking about this question of have we got the balance of work incentives wrong. And the red line is showing that really kind of what you get on job seekers' allowance out of work has fallen as a kind of proportion of what you might think of as kind of average earnings or a basic standard of living over time. And just the last kind of chart I wanted to show, thinking about this question of whether social security is damaging work incentives, is just to kind of point to this chart which shows that the state really is saying no quite a lot of the time already. So the green line on this shows the number of people receiving a fixed length sanction on job seekers' allowance. So the number of people whose benefits have been cut because they haven't complied with the job seekers' allowance rules. Big increase, obviously, because we've had a big increase in the number of people claiming job seekers' allowance, again, as an impact of the recession. But the blue line is just suggesting that actually, as a proportion of all of those who are on job seekers' allowance, the number of people who the state is saying, no, we no longer think you can receive benefits, is also on the up. Just quickly to kind of deal with my last question, you know, have we solved poverty? Obviously not. This is a graph showing relative and absolute poverty rates. Relative poverty rates now kind of stabilising at around kind of 20%, and absolute poverty rates, worryingly, just starting to tick up in the last year. Obviously, social security isn't the only thing that is influencing those poverty rates, but we know it's having a significant contribution, and we know we're going to need to keep spending in order to protect families from poverty. I just thought maybe kind of having suggested that perhaps the need for the state to say no is perhaps a little bit kind of less than we might have thought looking at those graphs, it would be good to think about where are the situations in which the state could be saying yes more often. I think there's a big and interesting debate going on around rewarding contribution at the moment, and where there are situations in which those who have paid in for longer could perhaps receive more generous support from the system. I think we also need to be thinking about protecting against new social risks. So one of the things that's been suggested is thinking about new payments when people are needing to time out of the labour market to care for either children or the elderly, and whether you could do that on a contributory basis. I think Policy Exchange have been doing some really interesting work about better support for people who are looking for work. It's pretty clear that that's not working all that well at the moment. Disappointing results from the work programme at present, and thinking about where that support could be better targeted. And then lastly, of course, you'd expect me to say from Child Poverty Action Group that we do need the state to do more to ensure that children are protected against poverty. And I'll stop there.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Oakley, Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange. I'm going to take the liberty of being the home team and the last two speakers not saying, probably not quite filling their time to take much longer. So get ready. And I guess, and I guess where I want to focus is more on the macro picture. A lot of the discussion so far has been on the micro detail, some specific policy kind of questions. So I want to take a kind of step back and think about where all this comes from. And from the outset, I think I'd agree with both the last two speakers that the welfare state is a vital part of our society. It supports people who are unable to work, sick, disabled, and supports those people who are falling on hard times as they move back towards work and re-enter work. It gives children the best possible start in life when they are born into families who maybe might not be able to kind of afford or kind of help them in the ways that other families can. And we also provide support to the pensioners when they retire. Now, all those things are essential parts of a functioning welfare state and a functioning society. I think those are all things that probably all of us here can agree on, and so far the panel have agreed on them. I think where the differences in opinion lie is I guess the extent and nature of the support that we give to each of those groups. So it's not a case of whether we should provide that support at all, it's how much. And that's why this kind of when does the state say no, or how far should the state go question, I think that's why it's so relevant. And I don't think it's surprising that this question is coming about now. I think the last 20 years has seen a fundamental shift in the extent and scope of the welfare state. So it's no longer just providing a kind of a social safety net, but providing a tool to tackle low pay in a long-term basis, a tool for tackling child and pensioner poverty through tax and pension credits. And I don't think if you asked people 30 or 40 years ago that they'd assume that those are the sorts of things that the welfare state would be providing today. And with those changes, I think we've seen the cost of the welfare state change. Kate showed the kind of last 20 or so years, but if you look back over a much longer time period, actually the cost of the welfare state, taken it in its entirety, so pension and working age, has actually increased quite steadily. And so today we're spending well over £200 billion a year, roughly split half and half between working age and pensioner benefits. And it's just worth thinking what that means in a different context. So that's 13.5% of GDP. Or in more kind of practical terms, it's around £7,000 per person for everyone who's employed in terms of what they're contributing to the welfare state. That's quite a lot of money. And also, I think it's clear to say that this isn't just about the recession, as I was saying. As I was saying, we've seen quite large increases since the figure I've got here, the 1950s, where as a proportion of GDP, we're talking more about kind of 5%, not the 13.5% that we have today. So there are quite stark changes in the last 50, 60 years. And taking some basic examples of why it's not just about the recession and its a longer-term issue, before the recession, housing benefit costs, we were spending £18 billion a year on housing benefit, £20 billion a year on tax credits. Now, during the recession, yes, we've seen increases to £30 and £40 billion respectively, but those large costs were still there before the recession. And I think that's why we've seen such a heated debate across the political spectrum, and also not just the political spectrum, but played out in our society. We've seen through the surveying, through the British Social Attitudes Survey, that support for the welfare state has been plummeting, basically. It means that less people support an increase in welfare spending, and more people think that the welfare state is causing dependency, or it's being played by those people on it. So just taking three of the questions from that survey, when asked whether the government should spend more on welfare benefits, over 50% of people in 1987 said yes. Just 30% of people in 2011 said so. If asked if benefits were less generous, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet. Just over 30% in 1987 said yes, 55% now. And finally, when asked around here, most unemployed people should be able to find a job if they wanted one. In 1987, the figure stood at 40%. Now it's at 60%. And these are quite stark changes in the attitudes towards the welfare state and how much people support it. And so it's unsurprising that the debate across both the Labour and Conservative parties is taking a much tougher stance on welfare. But I'd argue this isn't just a political or social effect, it's also an economic one. We know that overall public spending is rising as demographic change and an ageing population, combined with an ever-increasing demand for public services. And that's pushing overall public spending in a way which the OBR describe in their long-term fiscal sustainability report as clearly unsustainable, as the proportion of the size of public sector net debt increases steadily over time. Within that, we also see what's called annually managed expenditure, or in short, in longhand kind of welfare spend, rising over time. So at the moment that stands at around 48% of total government expenditure, whereas by 2017 we're talking more like 56%. Now this has a real impact in terms of what we get from the state. So imagine we have a fixed size of the state and say it's 40% of the state is the government. If the size of AMI or the size of benefits keep on increasing, we have to then offset that by reductions in education, in schools, in health services, in defence. And those are the kind of reductions in public services that I just think politically and economically are completely unfeasible. So it's clear that within the context of a rising bill, hardening attitudes from the public, increasing scope of the welfare state, and then projected future increases, that something needs to be done to make sure we're making the right choices and that those choices in the future are really informed by a public debate. And to some extent, that debate has started. We've seen changes over the last years since the coalition have come into power, and indeed since during the last Labour administration, in that we've starting to test eligibility for disability benefits more. We're talking around increasing the idea that actually the welfare state's about helping people move to self-sufficiency rather than about pushing them into any jobs, so the introduction of universal credit and the work programme. We've also seen significant AME welfare savings since 2010, some £22 billion of announced savings, including caps, reductions, extra tests, lower uprating of benefits. And here's one of the challenges, actually, what have we actually delivered? Well, in fact, if you delve into the Treasury's most recent publications, they show that while 22 billion has been announced over the last 2 or 3 years, actually, since the first spending review, much of the savings have all been put into trying to top up the previous savings because we haven't delivered the savings we thought we were going to when they were forecasted. And in this respect, it seems that the governments of all natures are always trying, or kind of running to catch up. I think there's 2 main reasons for this. First of all, that governments, for the last 50 years, have shied away from creating losers, taking the tough political decisions. You've seen this in this government. We're talking about cuts that have mainly hit working age claimants and have excluded the pension age benefits, as we were hearing earlier. And even inside the working age welfare budget, we've seen the introduction of universal credit, but people who move across to universal credit will be protected from any potential losses they would have had compared to their existing benefits. This limits the scope of any savings and also means you have dual systems running side by side where legacy benefits are then topped up or run alongside new benefits, meaning that you have added kind of administration costs and added complexity to the system. It also means that given that a lot of the reforms that have currently gone through have been taking the kind of low-hanging fruit, that future decisions are going to be particularly difficult. We're going to have to start taking the much tougher and much more difficult decisions. And I think it's going to take a strong government with a strong will and a very strong mandate to do that. The second area where I think governments are running to catch up is that they failed to face up to the structural problems that are leading to the rise in AME costs. Again, it's right that we're tackling working age benefits. It's not, I don't think it is right personally that people were claiming over £25,000 a year in benefits, or that we were paying tens of thousands of pounds a year in housing benefit. I completely agree that that should have been stopped. But the OBR analysis again shows that it's not working age welfare costs that are driving increases in the future, it's pensioner costs. So while working age benefits have remained broadly flat in their projections out to 2060, you're talking about as a share of GDP, a 50% rise in the pensioner age benefits. And that's a huge, and I'd argue, unsustainable rise. So together that the easy wins have been taken and the structural drivers still remain, I think this means that we need to have a much broader debate about what as a country we can afford, and hopefully that this kind of discussion here is kind of informing that. So we need to think about who's going to be eligible in the future, the level of benefits that they would take, and as Kate was saying, the level of contribution that they expect. And I think there's some kind of key questions within that, and looking a bit more specifically. As I was saying, we've started to pay top-ups to low pay through tax credits. Should we continue to do that? Should we continue to spend £30 billion a year topping up tax credits? Or should we simply cut that money and require people to work harder or longer? Or should we say, actually, we'll raise the minimum wage and then take the consequences in terms of a fall in employment? Second area, how many children should the state be willing to support? Polling that Policy Exchange did a couple of years ago showed that over 50% of people agreed that people with children shouldn't be given extra benefits in order to cope with the increased costs of bringing them up. And that 2/3 of people agreed that the number of children that are eligible for child benefit should be capped at 3 children. Now these are potentially huge changing when we see that 325,000 families in GB have 4 or more children. Some estimates put the savings as much as 4.5 billion. But politically that's quite, again, changes of this scale will take a very strong government to put them through. And also won't plug the full growth in spending that we're going to see in the future. Similar issues around housing benefit, where, again, if rents continue to rise, if cost of housing continues to rise, we will continue to see this rising housing benefit. And we need to tackle that in a way that's politically sustainable. And finally, again, bringing up the pensioner and pensioner benefits. Now, we have quite a heated discussion in Westminster about winter fuel allowance, around TV licences. But together they account for less than £3 billion. It's just the tip of the iceberg. You know, we'll take probably 1.5 billion at most from those two benefits. So we need to start looking much more broadly about the full range of options. And that's why I think actually, despite the criticism that both parties have received recently for talking about capping AME expenditure, so the welfare bill, despite the criticism in terms of the practicalities and how it's actually going to work, I think actually this is a really good policy. It says over a period of time, we will try and cap the level of expenditure we have as a country on benefits. But it does raise key questions where you've seen differences between the parties in terms of the level that it's set, which benefits go inside the cap, and how does government control expenditure once it's set the cap. Now I think, and Policy Exchange will be publishing on this hopefully in the next few days if I actually get writing quickly enough. I think there's some principles which underpin this, and I think going back to what I said earlier, that in terms of the limit, it's quite clear if we have an idea that the state should be a certain size within the total economy, that we need to make sure that AME is not taking up more than that than it currently is, which means that we need to peg AME to a level of a proportion of GDP. But for instance, that could be the level of AME GDP that AME was before the recession. In terms of what's inside it, as I've said, we need to have a broad debate around how we manage the future challenges of rising costs. So we don't squeeze out NHS, we don't squeeze out education, we don't squeeze out defence just to pay over benefits. And that means that we need to have a really broad measure of what goes inside the cap, which is about including pensioner benefits as well as working age benefits, and including disability benefits as well as working age benefits. Then thirdly, how do we control? I think there's two issues here, one on a broad sense, and I think actually if we set a cap in, say, a rolling 5-year period, much like the current fiscal mandate, we could have a situation where the government's required to put forward policy which means that the cap is hit 5 years in advance. In a narrower sense, it opens up questions about how we control government expenditure across government. So could we, for instance, bundle up a whole load of benefits, say disability benefits, and hand them over for DWP to control? and say, actually, you handle paying the benefits, you handle the control on the budget, and that then incentivises them to put in place measures which help them to get back to work, that help them manage their conditions, which overall reduce the cost of the state in the longer term. Similarly, could we do that kind of thing for those furthest from the labour market? We'll be publishing a report on Monday arguing that, in fact, those who are very hardest to help, we could bundle up benefits, hand them over in one fell swoop to people providing support, and then incentivise them to get them back into work as quickly as possible so they get the savings from benefits which would come from it. So I think those are all quite big challenges, and I'm going to shut up now. I think basically we're faced with quite difficult kind of next 20, 30, 40, 50 years where we're going to have to face some really big political questions, which frankly at the moment neither kind of side of the political spectrum are really facing up to. And I think actually the AMI cap which has been proposed is a really good framework within which we can start to think about those questions, and in doing so actually have an informed public debate. As a closing point, I thought the intervention in the FT yesterday from the Pensions Minister was a good start to that in terms of talking about the triple lock-in pensions, and I think basically we're going to need much more strength in purpose over the next kind of 2 or 3 years to continue that discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here at Policy Exchange for this panel discussion on what is undoubtedly one of the big public policy issues of our time. Sadly for you, I'm probably the least qualified, least expert, least informed member of our august panel, so please do bear with me today. I was thinking about Isabel's job today chairing, and normally you say last but not least Mehdi Hassan, and today you could say last and least Mehdi Hassan. But let me make the few points that I want to make in the limited time that I have and that I can make. Points that I try and raise in my own journalism as a non-expert, but as someone who is very interested in the politics and also the economics of this debate, which in my view is suffused in a great many myths, distortions, misrepresentations. Kate went some way towards touching on them. Last week, for example, the Office for National Statistics revealed that in 2011-12, 66% of children living in poverty in the UK were living in homes where someone worked, i.e. the ratio of poor children living in working compared to work-less households was a massive and depressing 2-to-1, compared, by the way, to 50-50 back at the turn of the century. Given these stats, to proclaim, as coalition ministers such as Ian Duncan-Smith regularly do, with zeal, with conviction, with alarmingly straight faces, that work is the route out of poverty, is, to quote good old Tony Blair, palpably absurd. It's nonsense to claim that getting a job in and of itself solves the poverty crisis, in particular the child poverty crisis that we have in this country right now. And yes, of course, as John rightly pointed out at the start, it does help bring down the benefits bill. Growth, economic growth, employment are key drivers in getting that bill down, but they'll never be enough on their own to get the bill down to where some of you might want it to be, especially those of you on the right of the political spectrum. Remember, we live in a country where, according to KPMG, 5 million workers receive less than the living wage, where the national minimum wage, as Matt just mentioned, is worth less in real terms today than it did in 2004, where shamefully, in my view, the number of people using food banks in this country, we learned recently, tripled in the past year, around 500,000 people. People who more often than not, according to the Trussell Trust, tend to be in work, not out of work. But that's the point. It's insecure, low-pay work. For me, the debate about welfare, or more accurately, social security, has to be a debate not just about the causes and consequences of joblessness, but the causes and consequences of low pay and falling living standards. For example, there is no point having a debate about the admittedly ballooning housing benefit bill that Matt touched on, unless we acknowledge, in the words of Shelter's Chief Executive Campbell Robb, that, quote, the vast majority of housing benefit claimants are either pensioners, disabled people, those caring for a relative, or hardworking people on low incomes. Only 1 in 8 people who receives housing benefit is unemployed. For me, that fact has to be at the forefront of any discussion on how to reform housing benefit. The whole debate On social security, Matt says we should have a well-informed debate, and I 100% agree with him. But it has to be a real-world debate, not just an abstract or theoretical debate based on sweeping statements and media-friendly soundbites. Take the contributory principle, which is so fashionable in political circles these days, which is all about putting in, not just taking out. Sounds great, sounds very fair and just in theory. Who could object to that? But I do wonder whether, say, upping the amount of money that some people who've worked for longer receive will then be funded by cutting the amount of money given to people who haven't been in work for as long, which of course also includes stay-at-home mums and carers, among others. How, after all, will we pay for the contributory principle? I've not yet heard the details. To put it bluntly, will it be the poorest members of society, those who John rightly said deserve the most, who have to sacrifice and suffer in order to pay for the contributory top-up? I mean, given how pathetically low job seekers' allowance is right now, £70 a week, 10 quid a day, down in value by a third in real terms since 1979. Is anyone in the political debate, on any of the parties, I wonder, seriously proposing cutting it further to justify paying for a contribution-based top-up? I don't know, but I am genuinely worried about the lack of clarity on this. Take means testing as well. What could be wrong with giving people benefits based on their income levels, at using means testing to target help to those people who need it most, based on their individual needs, rather than in a universal and supposedly unaffordable way? But wait, then you read the 2011 report from the National Audit Office, which points out that means testing, quote, makes the administration of benefits more complex and is associated with higher costs, as well as increased rates of fraud and error. Call me unfashionable, but I'm a universal benefits man myself, and that probably puts me in a minority in this room today, given what we've heard so far. I don't think Ed Balls and Ed Miliband's decision to abolish the winter fuel allowance for the wealthiest pensioners is the right move. I don't think it will help maintain public support for the welfare state, which has been dropping, as Matt points, although we might disagree about the reasons for that. I personally prefer the Ed Miliband, who told the Andrew Marr Show in January that he believed that, quote, universal benefits which go across the population are an important bedrock of our society. Or as the legendary LSE academic and social policy expert, Professor Richard Titmuss famously argued, services for the poor end up being poor services. I mean, you only have to look at the United States for evidence of Titmuss's argument. Now, in specific answer to the overall big question posed by Policy Exchange today, when does the state say no? I think there are some fairly obvious responses, for me anyways. Let me run through very quickly 3 of them. First, when people are defrauding the state, illegitimately claiming benefits they don't deserve, to which they're not entitled, I think we'd all agree that the state should say a big fat no. Then again, according to the DWP's own figures, in 2011-12, just 0.8% or £1.2 billion if total benefit expenditure was overpaid as a result of fraud. Second, when people are locked into an intergenerational culture of welfare dependency with generation after generation after generation of the same family, choosing welfare over work, the state should say no, or at least should say, is this wise? Shouldn't we intervene? Then again, good news. According to a Bristol University study, just 0.3% of UK households have 2 generations, let alone 3 or even 4 generations, that have never worked. Third, when social security spending gets out of control and we simply can't afford the modern welfare state, then we're going to have to say no. Thankfully, the modern welfare state, contrary to conventional wisdom, isn't unaffordable in my view. Benefit spending in 2011-12, depending on which figures you look at, accounted for around 11% of GDP, around the same as it accounted for under Margaret Thatcher in the mid-1980s and lower than under John Major in the mid-1990s when it stood at around 12% of GDP. In fact, it may surprise you to discover that benefit spending as a share of GDP fell during the first 11 years of the last profligate Labour government. It only began to rise in 2008 after the financial crash, as hundreds of thousands of Britain found themselves out of work through no fault of their own. Oh, and last time I checked, despite the banking crash, despite the recession and the subsequent austerity measures, we were still the 7th richest economy on the planet, able, for example, to print £375 billion simply by tapping a key on a keyboard. So forgive me if I say I think it's morally wrong and economically absurd to claim that we have to cut, for example, £18 billion, as we have done, from a supposedly unaffordable welfare budget, especially in the midst of the slowest economic recovery for 100 years, with 2.5 million people out of work, another 3.5 million underemployed, and with real wages for people in work having fallen year on year for the past 5 years, a, quote, longer and deeper cut in real wages than ever before, in the words of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. This leads me to my final concluding point, perhaps the most important point I want to make today, which is this. Should we have a debate about how to reform the welfare state, how to improve and modernise it? Isn't it time to look again, more than half a century after its creation, at the size of the welfare state and what we can and can't afford, at how to tackle the so-called dependency culture to the extent that it even exists on a substantive and national scale? The answers to those questions, in my view, yes, 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 and yes. But, and there's always a but, to borrow and slightly edit a line from John Maynard Keynes, my own view is that the boom, not the slump, is the right time for considering cuts and reforms at the Department for Work and Pensions. Thank you very much for your time.
We're now going to take questions from the floor. It's a nice amount of time to do that. We'll take 3 at a time and then go along the panel and see what they have to say. If it's anything else. So, let's ask a question. Maybe there, and the man with the pink tie after that.
It was pointed out by Matthew in particular about welfare becoming more and more unpopular and so on. But then there's also been studies by the TUC, obviously not impartial organisations, but based on research and studies, that the more people know about it, like the more details they know about exactly which benefits are being cut and who's losing and so on, the less that's true. And I wondered what the panel thought about that.
Thank you very much. Angus Hampton, Intergenerational Foundation. I'd like to ask the panel 2 questions. Would you believe, particularly in relation to the suggestion that the welfare bill is growing because of largely because of pensioners, would you leave free prescription charges for all over 65s, however wealthy they are? And secondly, would you have any sympathy for means testing the state pension as the Australians have done? Thank you.
One more. In the back.
Okay, this question from Matt, really. The final point in your speech, you seem to be suggesting that the hardest to reach families would have their benefits diverted to an agency who would then find them work and keep their benefits until they found it. Can you tell me if that is exactly what you mean, and if it is, would the rest of the panel like to comment?
Did you want to start?
I mean, I'll just take on board the first question was interesting about polling. I mean, I do a lot of debate. I'm actually doing a debate in a couple of weeks on immigration, and I'm sure the similar question will come up. I mean, this is what we find in public opinion, which is very hard towards immigrants and towards benefit claimants, and yet when you poll the public on what they actually know about the number of immigrants or the size of benefit payments, it doesn't really matter in reality. So when Matt says we should have an informed debate, I would have an informed debate. Some of us on the left are not running away from the debate. Let's have a debate based on facts and figures. And so when, for example, we talk about, when you look at that TUC poll, 27% is the figure identified by the public as benefit fraud, and the real figure is 1%. Okay, let's say you don't believe that figure. Let's say it's 2 or 3%. It's not 27%. I'm not sure how you can have an informed debate about where the state says no when there's that level of mass ignorance about the level of benefit expenditure and benefit fraud.
I mean, yeah, just to kind of reiterate that point, I guess the same thing that's been going on while we've seen this kind of increasingly negative public attitudes is we've also seen increasingly negative rhetoric used around benefit payments. And that's not reflecting any reality that's going on. The graph I put up showed that the number of people claiming out-of-work benefits was actually falling pretty substantially. So although there's this kind of perception out there that more and more people could find a job if they wanted to, actually more and more people have been finding a job and have been wanting to. So I think it's a good point. Just on the kind of intergenerational point, I don't want to make, it's kind of not my place to make specific points about specific benefit cuts, but we know that the kind of top slicing of individual pension benefits are not really going to cut into the kind of real kind of cost pressures caused by the demographic crisis. And I think, what we really need to be thinking about is the balance of our kind of working and non-working population, which means that measures to increase employment in the rest of the population, measures, for example, to get more mothers back to work, and kind of change the balance of who's working and who's not working, are actually what we need to be looking at here, rather than saying, well, cut a bit of the pension benefits, because that's not really going to be addressing the long-term problem.
As an elected politician who needs to win an election to keep my job, I have a rather different attitude towards polling to quite a lot of my colleagues. I am very interested in what electors think, but when it comes to influencing my policy positions, I think I'm quite swayed by what electors think the problem is. And I'm quite swayed by the general direction of travel they would like to go in at a very high level. But I would never dream of choosing my policy prescriptions from polling. Because people are not policy experts. If you poll them, they understandably adopt all sorts of completely incompatible positions. And if you poll them over a period of time, they change their minds. And I think these are wholly admirable qualities. But they are not the qualities that someone responsible for conduct public policy should follow. It gets those who do so into terrible trouble, and they look very stupid because they keep doing U-turns and making mistakes. So I think it is the job of the elected politician on good advice, good technical and professional advice, to take the ambitions of the public and to take the problems the public thinks are important and work away with professional advice as part of the solutions of my work. So on welfare, I wouldn't go by the polls on what you should do, but I would be very sensitive to general direction of travel that the public wants to go. On the specific question about should we make the state retirement pension scheme means tested, no, thoroughly not. There was a very strong feeling amongst the public that they have paid into their pension because they were told that their national insurance contributions were primarily a pension contribution and that they expect to get their just return on their pension contribution. And I do like the current trend of thought that, to some extent, strengthens the feeling of contribution. If you wish people to buy into the whole idea of the welfare state, including those who are not going to get means-tested benefits out of it, it's quite useful having a contributory principal major benefit, or pension, which they feel they've paid into. And that's why I would look at the question of cost and reward under the pension scheme in more actuarial terms, which is why I think you need to weigh up the age at which you are entitled to get it against the level of payment you're going to receive in relation to your contributions over a period of time. So I would go the opposite direction to you. I would say I want it to be more contributory. And then you have to deal with the issue of what do you do about those people who don't have top-up pensions or other savings, and that raises the moral issues both ways that I was mentioning earlier. My final thought at this stage is that as someone who's watched various people attempting welfare reforms over the years, my best piece of advice, and very simple, is it is comparatively easy to change future eligibility for a welfare benefit which people are not currently receiving, but is extremely difficult and can be unfair and painful to change the eligibility to welfare benefit somebody is already receiving. So if Policy Exchange wanted to go over to the 3-child families people on benefit, for example, it would be much easier to say, as from a year's time, no new 4-children families are going to qualify, than to say to people living in poverty already that we're going to take some of your child benefit away.
On the pension stuff, I think John's actually right that I think the general point is that we need to have a discussion about what we can afford, and we can't just put all of the burden on managing the welfare bill on the working age population when actually it is a huge driver of the older age and the pension stuff is a huge driver of the increases. But I don't think necessarily about means testing, or I think it can be about extending working lives or kind of other things which are kind of make quite nice savings as well. So that's what you need to consider really, is the full range of cases, and that's why you need to get everything on the table really. I guess on the stuff around whether people know more about benefits making them more popular, we've done some qualitative surveying of benefit claimants themselves in job centres recently, and actually they seem to be some of the toughest people around. And you'd argue that perhaps they know more about the situation than the majority of people in this room or more broadly in society. And again, I can't square the circle of why people are being so tough on benefits, particularly when they're on benefits themselves. And yeah, I find the survey data quite difficult. On your question about our new proposal, go and have a look at what happened under employment zones. The idea was basically that you can identify a bunch of people who you pretty safely say they're going to be unemployed for, say, a 2-year period, so you know how much they'll cost the state. You can then continue paying them benefits out of DWP, but transfer a lump of that money across to a provider who then becomes eligible for reimbursing DWP. They then get to keep any of the savings which they make from benefits, because they don't have to pay the DWP back, so they've got the incentive to get back to work as quickly as possible. It wouldn't affect in any way the benefits that the claimants get.
Can you quickly answer that? How's that different to the current kind of work programme?
In terms of work programme finance,
It's what will work.
in terms of financing stripped on its head, so instead of getting the money at the end, you get the money at the start, which means you've got the money to invest up front, so it eases cash flow for smaller providers.
It's a shifting cash flow proposal.
I know I'm the chair and I'm not supposed to have a view, but I'm going to butt in anyway with my view, which is, as well as politicians and rhetoric, actually I think journalists have a huge responsibility to operate in a reality-based community. Mehdi and I are very lucky on this panel that we don't have to make decisions, whereas the rest of the people do. But we do have a responsibility to use facts rather than our assumptions when we're making arguments about reform. I think one of the problems that we see reflected in the polling is that journalists don't always necessarily do that. So we'll take some more questions. This man on the front row here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Neil Barnfather, and I'm both an employer. I run a large internet company, as well as also being on the board of the One Foundation, which is a new organisation representing disability. The thing that's sprung to mind immediately is the old saying of lies, damn lies, and statistics, and perhaps should be tagged on the end of that, the media. Very interesting sort of idea that welfare seems to nowadays encompass everything from the jobless to families with low income, to children, to the disabled, to the elderly pensioners, etc. I think we need to sort of change this around a little bit and really take that a bit apart, if you will, because this idea of contribution really does sort of miss the point that there are people that certainly I, as a taxpayer, a considerable taxpayer, are really happy to give, if you will, a wave of the green flag to her. You know, someone who's, say, born with no arms, no legs, etc. Do you know, I actually am quite happy to say, if you want to work, I will do everything in my power to ensure you can have a job, a meaningful one. But if you find it too painful, you're unable, you know, certain people in society we must accept just cannot possibly work in the system as it stands. And we must accept that. We really, really must. So contribution-based welfare, benefit, whatever you want to call the thing, we desperately need to look at what that actually really means and what we're talking about here. Well, I am the worker in our household. My wife stays home and looks after our 3 children. What if I died next week? I'm only 31 years old. She's never paid a penny in tax whatsoever her whole life long. Is she no longer entitled to anything, despite the fact that I pay a 6-figure tax sum every year?
What's your question for the panel?
So the question is, the real question is, what the hell is welfare? What is welfare is the question. And what can we do as a society to really move people out of that need of independence, the dependency on the state? And my answer to that, if certainly as a disabled person, is to really demonstrate what can be done by these people. You know, so the unemployed, the disabled, the elderly, what can we do? And how can we do that? There you go.
Thank you. And then there's another man on that side.
Thank you. My question's on means testing. Can we get around this particular problem? Namely, that if we do have means testing, are we not going to make it more expensive in terms of the cost, quite simply, of administering the means test will outweigh any saving if it was a universal benefit?
Okay. Well, I think what is welfare and means testing probably 2 big questions, so we'll go with those and then we'll take another batch after that. We'll start at the other end of the panel.
What is welfare? And I could probably accuse myself of being flippant with welfare is everything basically. So I'm just talking in terms of welfare as the whole entire system. I think I tried to lay out inside of what I was saying that actually there's some principles of the welfare system as a whole which we can all agree with, that we should be supporting people unconditionally who can't support themselves, that we should support people who have fallen hard times, that We should try and help children get the best start in life, and that we should have some kind of provision for when people can't work in retirement. And those are, I think, principles people all sign up to. And we need different parts of the broadest kind of welfare system to tackle each of those different things. So completely contribution isn't everything. We do need a system which isn't about contribution, it's about need. But I would still say that contribution is an important element of the system going forward, so we get that support from the public. Means tested expense administration. Being an ex-Treasury civil servant, I should probably kind of toe an old party line and say that when HMRC data and DOP data are tied up, hopefully that'll sort out some of the problems, but we wait and see how that goes.
I would say that the marginal extra cost of means testing is quite small, because it's quite a high cost to universal benefit distribution as well. And that is more than recouped by the fact you don't pay so many people. So that is the case in means testing, that you are targeting what you're paying, and I hope you're paying a bit more per person because you can afford to pay more. I began my remarks by saying that I thought there were certain kinds of disability we weren't generous enough about, and I don't think that should be contribution-based at all, of course not. If somebody's born with a disability or they have an early accident or something, that's no reason why they shouldn't have to pay into the system. We all, I think most of us, want to be more generous and feel that we should do better. I mentioned contribution over the biggest item of the total transfer expenditure, which is the pension, because I think that is one where people feel they are contributing, and where we need to explain to them the extent of the contributory principle, because in practice it's not a funded scheme, and so it is one generation relying on another generation. So I am currently paying tax to pay my parents' pensions at the moment on the basis that I hope my children will return the favour and will pay my pension. It's a sort of pyramid scheme in a way. And it's fine all the time. There are enough people out there in each successive generation to meet the claims from the previous contributions and demands of the previous generation. So I think we need to strengthen that contributory principle. There's then the issue of whether you need to have a contributory principle over in-work benefits. And there is quite a mood in the Commons at the moment to say that you should say to someone that either they should be a British citizen, so they've just finished free education or whatever, and therefore have made tax contributions for that reason, or they have made tax contributions before they qualify for in-work benefits and other types of benefits, because there is a feeling that maybe we should have a national benefit system, not a global benefit system. I think that's an interesting debate to have.
I mean, I think I agree with both the other panellists that it's really important when we're talking about social security that we don't try and have kind of one organising principle for the whole thing. There's kind of two values pretty inherent in social security. There's reciprocity, which is about contribution, and the kind of intergenerational transfer that John was talking about. And there also is, of course, solidarity, where we recognise that we need to meet needs. But I do think one of the interesting things about the debate about contribution is it makes us think about who is able to make a contribution and how do we enable them to do that already. So in fact the system already credits in people who are caring for their children, so your wife should qualify, because the system knows that caring for children is obviously one of the most valuable contributions you can make, so you're credited into the national insurance system in recognition of that. And I think there is also an interesting conversation to say, well, why are so many disabled people prevented from participating in the labour market, and how could we enable that contribution? Just on the means testing universalism, I think there are additional administrative costs of means testing, but I think the kind of key issue probably is the one that John raised around work incentives. So when, let me be the first, in fact, amazingly, to mention Beveridge, but when Beveridge designed the initial social security system, he wanted universal child benefit to make sure that those who were out of work were not receiving more in benefits than those in work. And I think that's where the kind of real dilemmas between universalism and means testing arise around the work incentives.
I think the question of what is welfare is a very important one, because of course, Isabel mentioned journalists' role in this. Language is very, very important here. What we once referred to as social security has now become welfare. Where does it end? Where are the borders? Matt says it's everything. When we talk about the welfare state, for example, rather than the welfare budget, I think most people would instance that the welfare state also came along with the National Health Service attached. And I think, where do you draw these borders in terms of public services and things that are quote-unquote free, that you receive either as a taxpayer, or a citizen, or a child? And some of the language around the quote-unquote welfare debate suggests that those people who can kind of master the language are winning the debate. And Matt said earlier, I don't want to get into the polling and understand it. I mean, dare I say, I will say that I do think a lot of the polling is driven by some of the stuff about strivers and scroungers and shirkers and all of this stuff that we're hearing. We've heard actually under the last government as well, but increasingly so in recent years since the crash. Since the formation of this coalition, and therefore you need to get your terms right when we're talking about benefit claims. For example, when we talk about benefit claims, everyone here has pointed out that pensions takes up the vast, the 50%, 52%, whatever figure you pick, of the welfare budget. I'm not sure outside of this room that often comes across. And I think that's a huge problem from whatever part of the political spectrum you're on, whatever you're trying to achieve. Also, if we're going to talk about welfare, one thing that annoys me is we never talk about corporate welfare. If we're going to talk about money being given out to people, why don't we talk about government, how much money the government gives out to corporations and to, rail companies, etc., etc. How many billions are squandered there when we talk about affordability, PFI, the Great Welfare Scheme. On means testing, I do think there's an issue of expense. If you look at various reports that have been done, I mentioned the NAO office report, in certain benefits the cost of administration does go up, cost of fraud goes up as well, which I think is quite interesting. When you look at the report that Fabian did a couple of years ago of 11 OECD countries, they found that those benefits that were means tested have progressively withered in real terms value over the years, and that, of course, is a worry for me. I would hope it's a worry for John. John talked about generous, keep having benefits generous. It's a very difficult debate. Is means testing the solution? Not always the case. Just one specific point on, you mentioned immigrants and a national benefit system. I'm all for a national benefit system rather than a global benefit system, but we also have to bear in mind then that we have to acknowledge the fact that OECD figures produced just last week showed that immigrants put £7 billion into the exchequer more than they took out. So we have to factor that in when we talk about costs and benefits and balance and affordability.
Okay. One more round of questions.
Some predictions or proposals on what should happen in the future to the size of the housing benefit bill and its role.
Thank you. Mary Dejewski from The Independent. In the interest of journalists seeking facts, I'd like to clarify this point about pensions. Does the state pension, is that deemed to constitute part of the welfare bill? Or is it just the top-ups, like the income support and television licenses and all that? Because it seems to me that in the country at large, those things should actually be separate. And the welfare bill is understood to mean state benefits, not to mean pensions, and that pensions ought to be separated out.
Thanks, John Joseph Cooper. Could the panel name one policy each which they would most like to do if they were Chancellor, and how they would pay for it?
Okay, thank you. Let's start.
Good questions. On housing benefits, to go in order. In housing benefit, I think actually Ed Miliband's speech, which I criticised severely recently, during the section on housing benefit, I thought was quite strong. We made the point that 30 years ago, was it 95% was going into building, 5% of the benefits, and now that ratio is reversed. In terms of giving local councils more power to, in terms of negotiating rents. Let's be very clear, the housing benefit bill didn't go up by accident or by some kind of quirk. It went up through conscious policy decisions about allowing social rents to rise, etc., etc., and of course, the low pay factor that I've already mentioned. So I think there is a lot you can do on housing benefit, but I say it has to start from the principle that everyone on housing benefit isn't some kind of shirker, which is unfortunately what comes along with the political and media debate. To take on board the second question about state pension, I would defer to my colleagues about definitely, but my assumption is it is part of the welfare bill, and if you exclude it, it's quite interesting you say that should be excluded for the purposes of public debate. I mean, if you were to exclude it, then you would lose one of the big drivers of increasing costs, which would help everyone's arguments, I would argue, in terms of kind of unsustainability and unaffordability. If you are going to make that case, it's really in the realms of pensions, not in out-of-work benefits, that you are going to make that case, because the out-of-work benefit bill has gone up, as I think we all acknowledge, because of a recession. And when growth comes back, if it comes back, then things will turn around slowly on that front too. In terms of your question about what would I do if I was Chancellor? Oh my God, Sack myself. Apart from what was the specific thing I should do as Chancellor?
Yeah, if you actually had the power to make a choice, which one policy would you like to see done? Because it is sort of about, you know,
to do in relation to the welfare question, what, the whole thing or pensions and what?
In relation to the welfare question, so pensions.
Oh well, I'm going to steal John Redwood's line at the beginning and say that the best way to get benefit spending down, the one that everyone cares about and gets upset about in polls, is out of work benefits, and the best way to get that one down is to get growth in the economy, which means you do a fiscal stimulus, which means the exact opposite of what this Chancellor's done over the last 3 years. You get growth back.
Okay, I don't think I need to... Oh, one reflection on the kind of state pension argument. I think one of the things that sometimes happens in this debate is that kind of pensions are seen as good expenditure and everything else is seen as bad expenditure. And I think it's quite important that we recognise that social security expenditure is also a kind of productive contribution. It's enabling people to bring up their children, it's preventing destitution, which obviously costs us way more. And if we took that money away, we'd also be needing to spend more money. So to give an example of that, the government's currently in place is £26,000 to cut more benefits. In the 4 London boroughs where it's piloting that, it's had to invest an additional £2 million to deal with the cost of that, to deal with the increased homelessness that's going to result. So I think it's really important that we do remember that social security expenditure isn't just a kind of drain, it's performing a really valuable function. And I guess that kind of links to the housing benefit question. I think it looks like housing benefit expenditure is likely to rise as, you know, the lack of housing supply, as many were saying, leads to an increase in private rents. And I think there's pretty much a kind of political consensus now that we want to be building more houses, bringing the cost of private rented expenditure down. But I think what we don't know yet is how quickly we can do that, and I think we're going to need to carry on spending money on housing benefit to ensure that people actually have somewhere to live, and we need to recognise that as well. It's a tough question to say one policy. There's various kind of things I would undercut, but I think just to kind of give one positive policy, I do think there's a real role for looking at how you enable parents to better access work. And I think there's a real role for the parental leave system in enabling people to take a more kind of flexible time out of work. And I think I would look at a payment for parents in more... There's an existing period of 13 weeks of parental leave that you can receive, but it's unpaid. That enables many parents not to be able to take that up. And I'd look at some form of payment for that funded by contributions.
Very good. I do see the basic state pension as different from a welfare benefit, and I think most people do, because they feel they are paying in for it or have paid in for it, and I set out what I would deduce from that and what improvements and changes I would seek to make to that. But it is very relevant to the welfare debate for the reason we identify, because to the extent that the basic state retirement pension is not adequate to live on, and it clearly isn't, you then need to have welfare benefits to top up for those who don't have private savings or private pension schemes to provide the extra. And that's why that needs to be looked at in the context of the review. And the Coalition is trying to get a big boost to the basic state retirement pension, which should then cut some of the strain on means-tested benefits. So that's going in the opposite direction to the otherwise direction of travel in favour of more means-testing. And the good reason for having housing benefit, and all parties still believe there should be some housing benefit, is that there are people who cannot afford reasonable housing either for purchase or rent without state assistance. And we wish to have people properly housed. We wish them to have adequate housing with state support or better housing as they can earn more for themselves. And the danger of housing benefit, as I think all the main parties now recognise, is that you may just simply boost rents and prices and lose some of the benefit you're trying to buy, or make it more expensive because you're constantly bidding against yourself. You are in danger, of course, of the rents and the capital values up with the amount of housing benefit you put into the system. There is also another huge complication which causes all sorts of moral dilemmas, which is that there are parts of the country where there are a large number of relatively cheap houses available. Indeed, there are some parts of the country where they're even demolishing houses because they can't find people to take them on. And there are other parts of the country where there is a chronic housing shortage, where everybody wishes to congregate, where the prices and the rents are being driven ever upwards, particularly in central London, but there are other hotspots around the country. And so the housing benefit reform is trying to address this and it is very contentious, but it is trying to say to people, surely the state should support you to have housing, but not necessarily in the dearest hotspots where there is already too much pressure on demand, and the danger is putting more public money into that hotspot simply inflates the bubble more. And that is why the coalition has gone for relatively high level of support, and so there has to be some cap on it. Again, applying Beveridge Report, it's easy to do future tenancies, but it is much more difficult if you're wanting to have an impact on tenancies that are already there. So that is the background to that policy, and of course the solution is for more people either willingly to live in places where there are already plenty of cheaper houses, and we need to get better at creating jobs and activity in those areas, so that's a more attractive option. And or the construction of more in or near the hotspots.
I'm going to take home team advantage again and have three policies. The first one, building on John's point really about social property and where it should be and how we build more of it basically. And Policy Exchange published last year a report arguing that there are a huge undersupply of housing, both social and private, and a way to tackle that would be to sell off social property which is worth more than regional average when it became vacant, and then reinvest that money into building new social property which matched the needs of the population in terms of number of bedrooms and size of property. Doing that would free up around £4.5 billion a year without any cost to the exchequer. Add to that borrowing £6 billion investment in social property each year for the foreseeable future. It's a massive building scheme which I think most people here would get behind, I hope. Second one, and probably less kind of policy exchanging, which is kind of one for the future. I think I'd look at trying to reduce tax credits and offset that with the rise in the minimum wage, which is then, again, offset for businesses in terms of a reduction in their costs through the tax system. So you might reduce employer national insurance, increase the minimum wage and reduce tax credits. Everyone's better off or the same off, but there's less pressure on the state, basically. And then finally, as you know, I completely revitalise and change how job centres work, bringing the private and third sector more target outcomes on level of earnings rather than just trying to get somebody into any old job. And doing that will incentivise people to get people into sustainable work, jobs which pay more, and that would take the pressure off the state.
Well, I'm hugely impressed that during the lunchtime discussion we've managed to define what is welfare and what our pet policies agree with the chancellors. But unfortunately we have now run out of time, so thank you so much for coming and for all your questions. Thank you to our panel, to Matthew, John, Kate and Lady.